Collega's, mag ik vragen door te lopen en snel te gaan zitten, want we willen beginnen. Hiervoor is nog veel plaats. Collega's, ik stel voor dat we beginnen. Ik zie nog een aantal mensen binnenkomen. Als u snel doorloopt en een plek kiest, dan gaan we nu echt beginnen. En ik wil u even introduceren aan Mona Mourshed. Mona, it is a pleasure for me to introduce you. Mona Mourshed is director with McKinsey and leads the global education practice. She is the lead author of How the World Most Improved School Systems Keep Getting Better, a very important report very important in the education field, and we discuss it with a lot of colleagues. You will tell us about this report. Mona, thank you very much for coming from Washington to the Netherlands, and good luck with your presentation.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to continue the tradition which we had from last year's Congress, when we also spoke about our Most Improved School Systems report. And on the back of that, we were able to launch a pilot effort with 16 schools, and we'll be continuing that with 75 schools over the coming year. The report that I'll talk about today, though, tackles a different topic, which is education to employment. And in particular, what spurred this report is that when you open a newspaper on any given day, in any given country, you are guaranteed to find a set of articles that talk about the skills mismatch, or the education employment crisis, or that talks about the 75 million youth in the world today who are unemployed, and almost double that who are underemployed. And what's very striking about this topic is that we believe that there's very little data that actually can guide us in understanding what interventions need to happen at both the secondary school level and the post-secondary school level, and at the system level, in order to be able to achieve change. We'd even go so far as to say that the world's knowledge today about education to employment is where we were with school system reform over a decade ago. So we're even further behind on this topic than we are about school system improvement. So for that reason, we decided to undertake a research effort. And what we did was we did two things. The first was a survey of over 8,500 employers, youth, and education providers across 9 countries. And the second was that we visited over 100 successful education to employment approaches across 25 countries around the world. And so what I'll be speaking about today is a combination of those two data sets. And I'll be speaking both about what we found, but also spend quite a bit of time to talk through what can be done at the secondary school level, both at the system level and as individual school leaders, to be able to support students to more successfully move from the world of education to the world of employment. So let me begin with the facts on the ground. And what came out very strongly, and this is our first finding, is that literally today, education providers, youth, and employers live in parallel universes. It is not that one is right and the other is wrong, but it's just that they see the world in a very different way. And I'll just give you one example here. We asked the question of, to what extent are graduates ready for the workforce? And so from employers and youth, we got something around 40 to 50%. From education providers, we got 72% saying, yes, they're ready. And this was, and by the way, you may be interested to note that of all of the education providers which we surveyed, by far the most optimistic were those in the US. They were at 86% compared to the 72% for the global average. Now, when we then followed this up to understand, well, what is it that gives you this confidence? And what we found, because we were then looking for, well, do you know where your graduates actually land? Do you have data on job placement? And what we found that literally 1/3 of education providers couldn't even answer the question. And then those that did overestimated by 20+%. And there are some countries where they overestimated by 40%. So this belief that graduates are ready on the part of education providers has very little data that actually supports it in most cases. And so this is the first important piece of evidence around, do we really understand on what basis are the perceptions that we have? I would also say that when you look at the level of youth and you ask them the question, to what extent do you feel you are well informed to be able to decide what to study and where to study? On average, only 40% of youth say that they have the information that they need. And the information that we're talking about are things like, do you understand different career paths? Do you understand wage levels? Do you understand job openings? So everyone here is working with very little information as they make these really critical decisions about how to prepare youth and their readiness. So this is the first phenomena which we observed. The second is the fact that we were trying to understand what breaks down in the education to employment journey along 3 main milestones. The first is whether students decide to enroll in post-secondary education and what they decide to study. The second is around building skills, and the third is about finding a job. So we tried to understand the perspectives of employers, education providers, and youth across each of these 3 big milestones. And I'll just share with you just a few factoids around each of these 3 moments. So the first moment, and don't worry, there's a lot of data here. We'll not go through this, but the point being is, when youth decide to enroll, first of all, we found that over 45% of youth that don't get to post-secondary education, it happens because they can't afford it. Now, those that do, when we then ask them, okay, well, what is it that attracts you profession-wise? How do you decide what it is that you want to study? And we gave them a choice of 20+ professions from which to choose. We found a few phenomena which I'll just lay out. The first is that the professions around information communication technology, things around web design, graphics, they have at least the same, if not higher attractiveness than the traditional professions of doctor, engineer, lawyer. And we found this consistently across countries. And the reason why we pause on this is that these are professions that often do not require a university degree. These are professions that can require a 1 to 2 year degree post-secondary in order to qualify. In some cases, it can require a couple of months in order to be able to qualify. That is the first observation I would make. The second observation is that in some countries, you find very strong preferences about professions. So for example, Brazil and Germany have very strong views of 50 to 70% attractiveness ratings across different professions. In comparison to countries like the UK or the US, where the attractiveness never really gets beyond 20 to 30%. Which in and of itself is an indication of students just being very uninformed about the different paths that are open, to the point that they can't even differentiate between the different paths that are available. So I pause on this only to say this is shapeable. What we found is that you can actually change the way youth think about different professions and therefore what they want to study by shaping the view of what this profession is about. Second thing we would say is that when it comes to looking at vocational versus academic, by and large, almost all countries, and this is intuitive, youth across all countries would say, you know, even though I think that vocational is more useful in terms of finding a job, I'm still going to pursue an academic path because socially I think it is much more acceptable. The only country in the entire sample where there is equal social perception of vocational and academic is Germany. And that, I think, probably comes as very little surprise just by the nature of the system and the volume of students who enter into it. But this is to indicate high degrees of social bias that need to be overcome in order to be able to get students to think about the different professions. And it's only by talking about professions that you overcome the view of, is it vocational or is it academic? That debate is almost passé now. Third thing, now turning to building skills, when we ask students, what is the most effective way for you to learn? Over 60% would say it is by literally hands-on, you know, so hands-on experiences is how they prefer to learn. When you then ask them, well, how many of you are actually in programs that have these features, it's around 25 to 30% of students. So there's a very clear perspective that students have about what is the most effective way for them to learn, and yet we're not providing them with a forum and an opportunity to learn like that. And then turning to the final part of finding a job, I'll give you both the youth perspective and the employer perspective. On the side of employers, we found that 40% would say that skills are a leading driver for their entry-level vacancies, and that it causes significant business harm that they cannot find the people that they need. On the side of the youth, when we asked them to what extent they felt that their education helped them to find a job, only 1 in 2 youth, 1 in 2, would say that they believe that their education helped them in being able to acquire a job. In my mind, this is actually one of the most tragic findings of the survey. That then transitions into what actually happens when they get to the job market. And what you see here is that we have defined whether students land in jobs, you know, so of those students who find jobs, and there are many who don't, but of those who find jobs, to what extent is it linked to what they studied? To what extent is it not linked, but they're happy with where they landed, versus they feel that it's an interim job, so it's not linked to what they studied, and they view it as temporary. So on average, there are about 25% of youth who land in this particular category. And this is one of great concern, because this is labor market churn. These are the youth who feel like they did all the right things. They went to school, they studied, and yet they still haven't landed where they wanted to land. This is where you get social dissatisfaction. And it has a personal cost to the youth, and it has a social cost and an economic cost. Now, that is the problem. Let me now make it more personal. We often, when we talk about education to employment, talk about the youth and the employers, but that's a fallacy. There are different kinds of youth, and what we try to do is to actually segment the different youth populations. And our belief is that only if you understand the segments that you have in your secondary schools and in post-secondary, are we able to put in place the interventions that we need to help them to be successful? And I'll just give you 2 examples. We found that there were 26% of youth that we called struggling. These are youth who, if they had better information about job career trajectories, about wage levels, about job openings, that they would be able to make much better decisions about what they study. Compare that to the disheartened youth. The disheartened youth, and this is about 17% of the population, they are very much a function of their socioeconomic status. So they believe that their socioeconomic status determines their success in life. And so the minute they hit a road bump, they then feel, well, so then I'm now going to have the same fate of everyone else in my family or whom I know in my community, and they stop trying. And so this group needs an intervention that's very heavy on mentoring, counseling. You have to swarm them in order to be able to take this group of at-risk youth and put them on a different platform. Very different interventions for these different groups. And unless you know at the secondary school level and at the post-secondary which group you're dealing with, then we're going to have youth literally falling through the cracks. And what I'll come to in just a moment is that those systems that are able to segment their youth along these lines are able to be much more successful in getting more of them to a more successful path. I would say the same thing about employers as well. We found that you can also segment employers and find that there are different interventions you need to get certain employers to be much more engaging with education providers than others. Now, let me now turn to the solution because the problem is bleak and it is growing. What we found is that as we looked across the over 100 examples of successful education to employment approaches around the world, there were 2 things that were always true. Employers walk into the world of education providers, and education providers walk into the world of employers. And they engage in what we would call extreme interaction. So if you think of extreme sports, it's extreme interaction. And let me just describe what that means. On the side of employers, it means literally going into secondary schools or into post-secondary institutions and designing the curriculum along with the education provider. It means offering their own staff as faculty in these education programs. At times, they even themselves become education providers and open up their own academies or sponsor their own academies. On the side of the education providers, it means offering curriculum that is up to 50% practicum. It means offering classes actually at the job site as opposed to teaching in class. So it's this, and it is interaction that is happening weekly, if not daily. It is not something that happens once every few months at a career fair. That doesn't get the job done. It's literally daily, weekly. And what I'd like to do now is to just give you a few tangible examples of what this looks like at the secondary level. And I'll share with you 4 examples that we felt really exemplified this from different perspectives. So the first approach is what I would call the swarm. This is particularly used in cases where you have a high share of at-risk youth. And so this is a program called iMentor, which comes out of the US. It is a mentoring counseling program that pairs at-risk youth with mentors who are at college and who come from the same community so that they have very high resonance. So remember I was speaking earlier about the disheartened youth and the disengaged youth. So this kind of interaction is happening daily, weekly. And the mentoring is around building resilience, helping them to think about their life choices, helping them to think critically about whether they go right or whether they go left, helping them to, and literally in supporting them in whatever is their struggle in life as well as in school. This program is able to achieve much higher graduation rates than the average. So for example, if you look at the New York City iMentor program, those that go through, there's an 85% graduation rate for those in the iMentor program versus a 60 to 65% graduation rate for those that don't have this program and have the same at-risk profile. So this is the kind of intervention we need for disheartened and disengaged youth. If we now take the employer lens, I'll give you an example here from South Africa, Go for Gold. The construction and engineering sector are hard-pressed to find talent in South Africa. So what they've done is they've come together as a sector and they go after secondary schools and secondary school students, searching for those that have real talent in math and technical, so math, sciences, technical. And they're looking for great students. So they are looking for those who really demonstrate that they have the potential. And in that is a belief that there are indeed great math teachers and science teachers who are out there who are able to deliver a great pool of students. What they do is they take this group and they then offer them tutoring in math and science for their 11th and 12th grade. They have a summer program, and then upon graduation, they give students a 1-year paid internship at the companies that are part of this consortium. And then those students that excel the most are then funded by these employers to then partake in their post-secondary degree program. So this is an example of how do you have employers working in tandem with secondary school to achieve a certain set of skill and for particular professions where there's very little that is available in the country. I'll give you now an example at the system level from Korea. This is the Meister program. Korea has an interesting problem in that they have a lot of university graduates and not enough vocational graduates. And it's gotten to the point now where the university students are unemployed because there are just simply too many of them across the board in many disciplines. And so Korea decided that they were going to create an elite Meister program. So literally going after the top 1, 2, 3% of the student body to try to attract them into this Meister program. And the way they attracted them is to say, you will be guaranteed a job if you come out of this program, which is not the case when you go to university and you become like everybody else. And so what they did here was that, so they have 35 of these schools that opened in 2012. And in each community, there's a very tight linkage between the particular Meister school and the employers, which are the chaebol, in the community. The chaebols are working actively with these schools to create what are the skills that are going to be taught. They're actively creating what are the practicums and the simulations, and they're offering classes actually at the job site as well. 100% of the students who graduate find employment, and there were 5,200 who are enrolled, and this program is growing in attractiveness. And this from a country which has a very, very strong ethos of everyone must go to college. This is a sea change which is happening at the moment, which is just part of the notion of you can change social perception. They change the perception of parents in terms of what's attractive for their children. I will give you one more example of Kosen from Japan. This is what I call the hybrid. And we increasingly around the world, from Japan to the US, are seeing now these 5-year programs that are a combination of secondary school and post-secondary. And the idea is that you emerge from this program having the equivalent of an associate degree. So in the US, it's the equivalent of a community college degree. And it's done in tight cooperation with a set of employers who are actually creating the simulations that the school goes through. So for example, in New York, there's a high school called PTech, which is sponsored by IBM and various other ICT companies. And they're creating a cadre of these engineering literate, but applied engineering skills. What's very important here is that what they're doing is skills of application. There is clearly a recognition that there need to be theoretical engineers, but the world is missing the applied, and that's what these schools are delivering. And just to be very clear, they're going after at-risk youth. These are not the youth who come from wealthy suburban backgrounds. These are youth that are coming from inner city, socioeconomically disadvantaged, and they're learning these skills and getting very well-paying jobs on the back of it. So these are examples of interventions which we've seen at the school level. At the system level, what I would say is what we see today is that these programs, although we found them, they only help thousands of students at best. The world has not yet cracked the problem of how you solve this for hundreds of thousands, if not the millions of students who need them. And until we are able to, at a sector level, understand and have much better information about where students land, so for example, until we have data that tells us where students are being placed after they graduate, whether they find a job, whether it takes 6 months, being able to, for example, track what happens to students 5 years after secondary school or after post-secondary. That's the data that we need, and we increasingly are seeing countries engage in this. Colombia has a 5-year database and can tell you literally from primary school to secondary to 5 years post-secondary where students land so that they can help parents and students make better choices about what they do. Until we have more sector-wide collaborations whereby all of the key players in a given sector come together and say, how can we better support secondary schools or post-secondary to create the kinds of skills that we need? Until we actually, at a system level, also have an integrator that can span education, labor, industry, we're not going to organically see the kinds of changes that we need to create the scale that's needed. I'll just make one more point and then we'll turn to questions, which is to get to scale, one of the things that we're most excited about, and it's something that can be undertaken at individual schools, is about serious gaming and simulation. There is no doubt that apprenticeships are the most successful way for students to learn. We heard that from the students, we heard that from the employers. And we also, by the way, heard that as well from education providers who have also engaged in this as well. However, there are simply not enough apprenticeships in the world to go around. And so what we have seen is a phenomena of serious games that are created around the workplace context. And so literally, students are able to play these games repeatedly in order to be able to get a virtual workplace experience. And there's evidence that literally every time they play the game, their skills increase by somewhere between 10 to 15%. So in many ways, we believe that simulation is going to become the apprenticeship of the 21st century. And that, ironically, the future of hands-on learning may well be hands-off by way of using these games. It is not perfect. Clearly, it will never be a substitute for a complete substitute for human interaction. But it is much better than the traditional lecture mode, which we have happening today. And it's, as I say, something that we increasingly see being experimented with around the world. So I will pause here. This is just an example of what some of these simulations actually look like. And very happy to have a conversation about the application of these ideas to your schools and to the Netherlands more broadly. For anyone who wants to ask a question, I've been told that you need to come to the mic in order for the recording to be successful. So I'll just pause and let's have a dialogue. Questions?
Good morning. You're speaking about a system of data and employment and skills. Where do you start?
So that depends on the system, but I mean, essentially, the problem happens because employers, education providers, and youth are, as I mentioned, in parallel universes. So until we get them onto the same page, it's impossible to change this equation. So the starting point in many systems which we've seen has been around employers coming together, either a very large employer or a set of employers in a particular sector to say, what are the skills that we need? I'll give you one example, the auto manufacturing industry in the US. Over 30 auto manufacturing companies and their suppliers, and over 30 community college providers across 13 states came together to define what are the skills that any entering auto manufacturer worker needs to have. They then aligned on these sets of skills and then worked together to create a 50% practicum program that was going to be delivered both at the community colleges and at the facilities of Toyota, Ford, GM, et cetera. And they then worked heavily to be able to attract youth to these professions, so major campaigns at secondary schools, et cetera. That is one example of what it could look like. Another example is when we see the actual pre-hiring of youth by employers based on their intrinsics, and only after the pre-hiring are they then put in training in order to then emerge with a job on the back end. That's another model which we've seen. We've seen a third model, which is driven by education providers that are very proactive and that are essentially saying, look, we want to be able to support our students to succeed as much as they can. And they proactively go to employers in their communities and say, first of all, what is it that you need? Two, how are we doing in terms of how we deliver that today? And how are we going to work together in order to be able to get to a better place? These are the types of ways that we've seen these things kickstarted. The data definitely needs to be gathered, but it can be something that lags as opposed to leads, dependent on the particular country circumstance. I'll actually offer just one more thought, and this is, I think, something that has given some people pause. We have found a set of examples, and I'll give you one from the US. It's called Dev Bootcamp in San Francisco, and it focuses on creating software coders. And they take students, like 60% of their students are high school graduates. They put them through a 9-week immersion program, hence the name bootcamp. And at the end of it, 90% of these youth are emerging with $100,000 entry-level positions in coding. Right? 9 weeks. The companies say that they are literally performing at the level of software coders that have gone through 4-year programs. What is, and I can see the expression on people's faces, and you think that that's crazy, but what lies behind that is a focus on what is the 10% of skill that is most important to doing 80 to 90% of your job. And just to be clear, they're not just teaching them coding, they're teaching them how to work in teams. Because for a coder, for you to be successful, you must be able to work in a team environment. You will not last unless you do. And they have they have feedback 2 or 3 times a day with their various team members. So this is not just teaching them a technical skill, they're teaching them how to be successful peers and colleagues and work in teams. And they're able to do this. The fact that they can do this in 9 weeks should give all of us pause. And I think it really brings into question, how are we thinking about the current model of education from secondary onward? Because if we can be more successful in identifying that 10%, then this can be translated to other disciplines. It doesn't just have to be a coding thing. Anyway, other questions?
Good morning, thank you very much for this lecture. One question, what does that mean for this change for the way we set up our examinations in secondary schools? Because those are very academically organized setup at the moment.
Yeah. Really important point. I mean, so for those secondary, so for example, for the COSEN, the Meister programs, it's about practicum. You know, it is, the proficiency assessment is not discipline-based. It is practice-based. You know, so it's not passing the math test. It is actually having to undertake a project or some type of practicum simulation that demonstrates that you have internalized the skills such that you can do it. And this obviously requires much more effort. I mean, it is much easier to just give the math test. This requires much more careful thought about what the simulation or the practicum needs to look like to really effectively test, did you absorb the skill or not? And that also has implications on teachers, right? Because unless as a teacher you are successfully able to do this, and by the way, as a school leader, that you're able to create the environment such that your teachers can work in this very different way, that's much more inquiry-based, that's much more practice-based, then the whole system falls apart. So this is a very different model of what secondary school and post-secondary school looks like.
Your presentation was an avalanche of new insights, so I can imagine that it's kind of hard to have a strong discussion about it now because there are so many things you told. But 2 things struck me. The one was that in Germany, people both appreciated an academic or a vocational career. If you go to Germany, you go to a baker shop, there are these enormous diplomas from prestigious bakery institutes, and I think that's a strong thing, that we should be able to create institutions where you have to be someone to be allowed to enter and to become a very good baker. Another thing is that making a choice in a profession is very difficult, and I didn't really find that back in your story. I have 2 children that struggle with their future. They don't know what to do because there is so much to do. And how do you organize focus in a school? Because especially in a vocational institute where you have to pick a course, how do you know which course is good for you? That's my question to you.
Sure. So to the question of how do you as a student navigate, you can have a seat. Yeah. So to the question of how do you as a student navigate, how do you make the right choice, right? And so there are a couple of things that we've seen that are quite important. I mean, so one is just frankly information about what does it mean to become the web designer versus become the lab technician versus become the doctor versus become the engineer versus become, so what we do see is the UK, for example, has a careers site where they have an abundance of careers, and you click on one and you sort of see the day in the life, right? And you are able to access people who are actually in those careers, and you can ask them questions. And they will also describe, these are the attributes of people who are more successful in this kind of a profession, because if you have a personality that likes A, B, C, D, then that gets called upon, right? So that's one type of information set. There's also very heavy mentoring counseling to help students to understand from those that have actually had those experiences whether it works or whether it doesn't, but even more importantly, it's exposure. So something like Go for Gold, they figured, unless we expose students to what it's like to be in our engineering world, then they're going to look at engineering and think, that just looks too hard, or that's just not exciting, and I don't want to do it. But you expose them to it, and then they see that it's fun, or it could be, hopefully if they're exposed well, that it's fun, it's exciting, etc. We've even also, from a social perception, seen the clever use of TV shows, so popular TV characters on TV shows who are scripted into entering different professions so that it becomes popular in terms of mass appeal. This is done in the US, it's done in South Korea, so there is also a subliminal effect as well, which can be used for certain professions that people really want to try to encourage. So these are the types of things that help students and their parents, by the way, to make the decision. And of all of those, it's information, it's exposure. I'll give you another example. Apprenticeship 2000 in the US. So it taps secondary school students to go into highly automated manufacturing programs, so mechatronics. Parents, and this is in North Carolina, parents thought that manufacturing is something that's dirty and dingy, and I don't want my child going into that. And so they created a program whereby students must come with their parents to go on a tour of the facility. And you enter into it, and it's white and gleaming, and there are robots and lasers, and then all of a sudden you think, actually, this is something that's really cool and exciting. And so that's the kind of effort which these employers are undertaking. They're showing the side of their profession that's exciting and engaging, and that's how they're trying to affect student opinion and parent opinion. Any other questions? No, please.
This one also works, yes. Thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. My question is, I see that there are, I think, very, very big implications for teacher training programs if you want to implement programs like this in the secondary school.
Sure.
Have you seen any examples of teacher training programs that were, in a way, preparing for these programs?
Sure. So if I look at the Meister program in South Korea and the Kosen program in Japan, so what these two are doing is, so first of all is who are the teachers, right? So there are teachers from the existing secondary school system who are trained differently, but then there is also bringing in a different kind of teacher, like actually coming from the employers to actually bring that practicum experience, because there are some things that you can never teach unless you've been there. So similar to, for a professor at a university to teach a teacher how to do classroom behavior management is quite difficult. You really want a great teacher to be teaching a group of teachers how you do classroom behavior management. It is the same thing when it comes to these types of practicum skills. You want great plant managers, or you want people who are tremendous in whatever is their field to come into the classroom to teach these practicum classes. So there is the mix of who's actually the teacher, And then second, I think there was also, this also came up in a question earlier, it's about helping teachers to really focus on what are the skills we need to impart based on what the demand is in the market. What are the best simulations that we can have in the classroom or at the job site to really be able to test for understanding? And how are we going to evolve that? Because literally every 6 months, they're going to want to change it. It's not something that's going to be static. And so, sorry, I've lost where you are in the crowd. Hi. And so literally, this is something that's, it is intensive, but it results in much higher outcomes for students. And so it is well worth it in terms of engaging. But is it difficult? Yes. Is it complex? Yes. Is it possible? Equally, yes. We have time for one more question. It's going to go to you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for your presentation. I have an age question, because in Dutch education we've tried to develop a broad-based vocational education between 12 and 16. And that means that children at the age of 13 are required to take decisions as to their future, and we tend to think that's a bit young. And in the examples you've provided, it strikes me that these are schools that offer education for older students. So that this kind of choice, that is a narrow choice for a narrow curriculum, is relevant for students aged 16, 17, 18. Is that correct?
Most of these examples, you're right, are from 10th grade onwards. For those students that enter into the Kosen program in Japan, I mean, this is a 5-year program, so you start from, from 8th grade to have made that decision. But essentially, we are not saying that there is a certain age which is right versus wrong, because this is very much, I think, a function of country philosophy about how do you think about streaming students. So this is not a commentary about when is the right time to stream. It is a commentary about, for those who stream into the vocational/practical sides, then what does the education need to look like such that it's successful in terms of supporting them in their life beyond school, and also for post-secondary. And it's also a commentary about, for those youth who are most at risk, that can start, well, I mean, that starts in primary school, right? So students who are at risk are going to require a higher level of engagement and counseling and support. And I would also say just very proactive case management. So for example, as soon as you start to see them missing class is when you need to intervene. You don't wait until a test has been failed at the end of the year. Right? And so that's what we're calling for here, more so than saying there's a certain age at which it should begin or not begin. So I'll just pause here so that you stay on schedule for the rest of your program. But thank you very much. The report is available on our website and can be downloaded. So if you would like to get access to it, it's online. Thank you, and I wish you the best of luck for the rest of the Congress.
Yeah, Mona, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. Your message about education to employment is loud and clear. Not easy for our schools. I hope you have inspired us. I hope you have inspired us so much that tomorrow we will go to work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.